All right. Cool. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Again, my name is Rob Zwiebach. I am currently Vice President of Product Management for Financials at Workday. And so just brief introduction about myself. I have been working in the enterprise application space across product management and development positions for about 2 decades. It's a pretty deep experience. I had an early experience at a company called Interworld, which is sadly no longer with us. Interworld was a fairly early entrant into kind of online storefronts in some of the early days of CRM based in New York. Most of my experience has been at Oracle and more recently at Workday. For any of you who are not familiar with Workday, we are an enterprise apps company, SaaS only, started in 2005. We are the industry leader in human resource applications. However, I work in the financial applications area where we are not yet the industry leader, but we intend to be. So that is my role. And in my spare time, I play the drums, so I had a little kind of picture of a little drum kit, just because drums are fun. So what I'm here to talk about a little bit is how to scale enterprise product organizations, and that's something that I'm probably in a good position to talk about because Workday, my current employer, has been going through very, very rapid growth, and we are basically, now kind of at the point where we have a product organization that spans a little over 100 people, which is pretty large. And in order to kind of get to that point, and in order to kind of keep going and keep growing, there are some interesting challenges that I think you don't often see, just because it's not probably that common to have an organization of kind of that scope. So the way that we are currently organized is basically kind of a 3-tier structure. The orange box at the top is essentially me, if we're looking at this from a kind of HR perspective. So this is my team. And so basically, the way that we've organized is by having, as you can kind of see, 2 layers of managers in between myself and individual contributor product managers. I mentioned the number of slightly over 100. You can probably kind of extrapolate from there. But so what that typically means is we'll have, we try to have a span of control at each manager level of somewhere between probably 5 and 9 people. And so this is not the whole thing. This is just meant to illustrate the number of layers that we've gone with. But, each of these folks has more than this typically reporting up to them. The product itself is kind of an interesting question. So we're talking about an enterprise set of applications. And so one of the challenging aspects here, and I think this is probably fairly common in the enterprise space, maybe not so much in the consumer space, is that when we talk about, what is the product, what are we actually selling, the answer depends on how you're looking at things. So in terms of kind of any external audience, the product really is financials. That's really what we sell. We sell some, smaller SKUs, some smaller add-on modules, but really for the most part, this entire organization of 100+ people is really responsible for a single product, which is called financials. And so what I mean by that is most of our customers are buying from us a single cohesive suite that's used to really automate their entire financial management. So that means the entire kind of accounting function, the entire kind of finance and planning function, which spans a number of different job areas. So for those of you who aren't, accounting geeks or CPAs, we're talking about accounts payable and accounts receivable and assets management and purchasing and general ledger and financial reporting and so on. So it is a fairly kind of large set of functionality, but the way that companies want to buy this typically is in a single cohesive suite from a single vendor. And so when we talk about the product, really we are talking about overall financials. However, you can't really manage a single product with 100 people like that. And so as a result, what we basically have done is we've structured the organization so that internally we look at products more at this level. And so this level, I mentioned before the notion of things like accounts payable and general ledger and fixed assets. Really, those are the way that we define our products internally. And so typically we will have a manager who's responsible for each of those. So this is, we don't have accounts payable on our price list. We don't actually sell anything called accounts payable. But when we go talk to customers, we are typically talking to them in those terms. We are typically talking to an accounts payable department distinctly from the asset accountants, for example. And so there is pretty good alignment between really kind of this level and the specific job roles that we see at our customers. So the way that we're typically organized then is we'll have a manager for each of these kind of internal modules with maybe 5 to 8 product owners, depending on the scope of that area. And again, each of these, a group of these kind of products will roll up to a product area lead, which is typically we try to organize that kind of functionally. So we have a product area called pay, for example, which basically spans all of the modules involved in making payments. So that includes things like bank integration, that includes things like payroll processing, that includes things like accounts payable. Whereas we'll have another product area called core, which will be more about the core accounting functions. So these are more the things that we are, where the users are CPAs or hardcore financial analysts. So this is a list of some examples of what PMs typically do. This is not meant to be exhaustive. I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you guys what PMs do. I don't think I need to do that. And I'm not the authority to do it anyway. But it's just meant as an example. And one of the key points is that there's a lot of variety here, right? So one of the things that I think appeals to a lot of people about being a PM, it's one of the things that appealed to me when I first kind of got into this type of work, was the fact that there's a lot going on, there's a lot of different things that you do, and so every day is not the same. You're not just kind of sitting at a screen necessarily doing the same thing day in and day out. There's a lot of variety, and there's often a lot of autonomy to try to figure out what's most important, what do you need to be doing. That may vary, obviously, by organization, but that seems to be one of the kind of aspects of the role that appeals to a lot of people. So that's cool. That's great. But again, when you've got a team of 100 or so people, it can become very difficult to manage this way, right? If you have 100 people with a lot of autonomy who are all kind of doing these overlapping things and figuring out what to focus on, day 1 to day 2, you can get into a lot of chaos. It can be very difficult to manage. And so the way that we've tried to do things with this organization is to really kind of narrow down who does what, and we've typically done that based on the manager level. So what we've really tried to say is certain aspects of that PM role are going to be done by the individual contributors, and other aspects will be done by these management levels. So these management levels are not purely, HR managers. These are not purely people who are just responsible for, managing the careers of their employees. They do play a role in product management, and that's necessary because, as we already said, in certain aspects, the product we're selling is these things. In certain aspects, the product is that. And so that kind of implies that we couldn't really just kind of say, okay, so here are our product owners, our product managers. They're the ones who kind of actually do the work, and then we just manage them. And so what we've done is we've basically assigned things like road mapping to really these kind of management levels. And this is not meant to suggest, first of all, I'm not telling you that this is the way to do it, but I'm just, this is what we've done, and this is what we've seen works. And so one thing I should just say up front is, please do feel free to interrupt me at any point. Please feel free to ask questions. I'm very happy to have any kind of discussion. There may be other ways of doing things. There may be better ways of doing things. So, I'm open-minded. But the way that we've chosen to do it is this way. And this, again, is not meant to suggest kind of, big brick wall between these things. Road mapping is one of the things that people really tend to like to do. They tend to like to really kind of look forward and help to kind of identify where the product should be going. And this is not meant to suggest that we don't involve our product owners in those discussions at all, but we do typically involve them more as contributors, as advisors, with the understanding that they're not really going to be responsible for defining their own roadmap. That's really going to be done more at a managerial level, right? So there's some pros and cons to that. Again, the con is that that's one of the things that people like to do. On the pro side, if you distribute that too widely, you're going to get chaos, right? If you've got a huge number of people all kind of developing their own roadmaps individually, that's fine if their products are all very kind of well defined. But when we're talking about people kind of working on a single cohesive set of functionality, it becomes very difficult, and so it really has to be managed a little bit more closely. The other con is that people may feel that their opportunities are limited, right? They may feel, again, like, they want to be doing other work, they want to be growing in some of these skills, and they don't have that opportunity. That's hard. That's a hard problem. The way that we try to deal with it is by really kind of understanding individually what's important to each person, what are things that people want to be able to grow toward, and finding kind of targeted opportunities to involve them, but still with the idea that the ultimate responsibility for things like road mapping and field enablement resides here. So then on my side, it's a little bit more focused on a little bit more the long term. From a roadmap perspective, a little bit less detailed, more a little bit long term. Things like pricing and packaging, because again, this is really done at the kind of overall level. As I look at this, I realize it makes it look like I don't do all that much. There's not that much there. Obviously, there are other things that I do. But the other key thing is, of course, people management. Depending on the organization, that may be a big focus or it may not. At Workday it is. So at Workday, we take it very seriously. And so people management is a big function of the role. Ensuring kind of strong career development for the people you manage is a very big focus. And again, that's important. It's a very important aspect of PM work for a lot of people. And it kind of dovetails well with some of the other things that I mentioned. But again, it's hard, right? It's a challenge. And unfortunately, for this perspective, the direction that we seem to be going is toward more and more specialization, so not away from that, and I'll talk more about what I mean by that. But we are basically kind of making the decision that there are cons to having this level of specialization, but we think it's worth it. We think that it's important from an organization perspective. We think that in order to be able to tell a cohesive story to our customers about such a kind of broad-ranging set of functionality, there's no other way to do it. So I mentioned before that we've grown rapidly. And in the kind of earlier days of Workday doing financials, as you can imagine, you're trying to staff something up new, so what do? You figure out how to work with the people you currently have, right? What we find in the specific set of products that I deal with, which is, again, financial management, the end users tend to be accountants. They tend to be pretty highly skilled people with pretty specific knowledge. And so what we find is that if we want to have credibility with them, we have to have product managers who can talk the talk, right? We have to have product managers who understand exactly what they're dealing with on a day-in, day-out basis. And so, I list here some of the kind of obviously desired skills from PMs and some of the common backgrounds. And the practitioner is the one that I kind of came in personally saying, this is what we need, right? This is how you staff up a product management team. You go out and you hire practitioners. So if I'm going to have people go talk to an accounts payable department, I want people who work in accounts payable department. If I'm going to have people who need to go deal with project managers, I want people who've worked as project managers in big four consulting firms, things like that. And so early on, most of the staffing emphasis was on practitioners, was on bringing people with kind of real-world hands-on experience into the organization. There are, some other kind of common roles here, and again, I may have left some off, but what we've typically seen is, we certainly do start to see people who have product management backgrounds, who in some cases have credentials. It is, it's become a domain of its own. That's great. We see implementers. This is, in the enterprise space especially, I think, we see this being a good fit. People who've been consultants for a number of years, maybe want to get off the road and maybe want to be able to kind of leverage the experience that they have implementing and deploying solutions for customers into building the next generation. Makes a lot of sense. As well as, we've seen some success of moving people over from like quality assurance or doc roles. But when I came in, I really felt like, no, practitioners is the way to go. That's all I want. That was wrong. Okay, it doesn't work because you definitely need practitioners, and you definitely, again, I do think it's important that when you're going to be talking directly to customers, you need to be convincing, you need to be credible, and having practitioners is probably the best way to do that. But I totally underestimated the complexity of people coming in with a practitioner background learning the product management skills. So I kind of came in saying, oh, it's fine. They can learn the rest of the stuff, right? All the skills over here, customer empathy, communication, they can learn all that. But the domain expertise, they can't learn. That you can't fake, right? That you have to have earned through work as a practitioner. There's no way around it. The rest of the stuff they'll learn. And again, it was wrong, right? It was wrong. It was, there's still some truth to the fact that you do, I think, need some degree of domain expertise, and you can't really fake that. You can't really get that other than by having practitioners, but you need other skills as well. You need other backgrounds as well. Not all of these skills can be learned, or at least can be learned as quickly as needed. And so I totally, I think, overestimated the ability for people to come in with a practitioner background and just learn the rest of the stuff. It's not as easy as I thought. And so maybe I'm the only person who thought this way, but just, learn from my mistakes if not. We've definitely seen that we really need to be hiring a more kind of broad range of experience and a more broad range of skills and balancing out different skills against each other. And so the way that we've started to do that is by trying to view each team of PMs, and again, a team we're typically talking about 5 to 8 people or so. We really try to view that team as a portfolio of skills. And so we use a kind of simple thing like a spider chart, where each of these lines represents a person, and each of these axes represents a skill that we think is important. And again, not meant to be definitive. You by all means will have some different choices, but this is what we want. We say, okay, we want people who have some technical ability, who have a strategic mindset, who have some domain expertise. But we understand that it's hard to find individual people who have all of that. And so we manage it as a portfolio, and we try to look at where are we strong and where are we weak and where do we need to invest, where do we need to hire to address that. And so we really do try to view the team as a kind of combined set of skills. Now that's not perfect, but it seems to work pretty well, and it's definitely better than just hiring practitioners. The other thing I'll mention too with the practitioner approach was that one of the challenges that we faced the most was that, and again, this may vary from organization to organization, it may vary from functional area to functional area, but certainly in my experience, what we've seen is that product managers have to be able to not just explain requirements, explain why something is important, but they need to really be able to do that to a variety of audiences with great patience. And what we typically see is that where we've seen some challenges with practitioners, and I'm making generalizations here, and obviously, not everybody is the same, but where we have seen some challenges with practitioners is that they often can get defensive about feeling like they're being questioned. And if I'm sitting there and saying, look, I'm a CPA, I've been doing accounting for 20 years, who are you, Mrs. Coder, to challenge me on that, right? Whereas in reality, the challenge is probably meant in good faith. It's probably meant of the person either trying to understand it or, just generally, genuinely curious, genuinely just trying to do the right thing. And what we've seen in some cases is that can be really perceived as a direct challenge. So something to keep in mind. But so, is there a question? Sure. Sure. Yeah? Yeah, it's a great question. So if folks couldn't hear, so the question was on communication. Can I go back? Okay. So yeah, I just put a single word up there. And I actually did that on purpose because I agree. Communication means a lot of things. It includes written communication. It includes spoken communication. It includes this right here, what I'm doing right now. And it includes talking to a lot of different audiences, right? And that's definitely not something that can be understated, right? The fact that talking to an audience of developers is 100% different than talking to an audience of end users. And that, I think, is probably the most important skill, frankly, for a successful PM. I think, obviously I'm talking in broad brush here, broad brush strokes, but that's really the key. And again, that's probably the area where I was probably most naive about how people can learn that. Because it's hard, and it takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of patience. There is definitely negotiation involved. There is definitely the ability to make trade-offs involved. And, how do you learn that? Well, you can learn it by doing it, right? You can learn it by, being mentored well. But again, I think you have to kind of go into it with an understanding of what skills a person lacks and really is going to need, a real kind of development plan on versus just being able to pick things up naturally. So in any event, the gold line here represents the kind of best across the team, right? So the gold line is not a single person. Again, if you find a person who represents the gold line, hire that person. But you probably won't. It's hard to find people like that, and that's okay, right? So what this is really trying to represent is, where is the team strong, and are there any real gaps that we're going to need to go hire for in this area? Maybe less so. Now, we at Workday have embraced a pretty pure kind of implementation of Agile. So we're pretty good, I think, in terms of kind of adopting the tenets of Agile methodology. We are organized pretty definitively around Scrum teams, where most of the individual product managers in my team are basically, bless you, members of a Scrum team with 3 or 4 engineers, a Scrum Master, a quality assurance engineer, and that's really how they do their work. And so that's pretty cool. It works pretty well, but what that does mean is that if you're going to be viewing your PM team as a portfolio of skills like this, that's great, but you need to pay a lot of attention to which people are going to be involved with Scrum teams. Does that match up well with their skills? And where there's a gap, how are you going to flesh that out, right? And I guess where I'm going with this is that if you're really going to try to view the PM team as a collection of skills, that kind of forces you to ensure that the PM team collaborates well, right? And it forces you to ensure that people are kind of, not just holed up in their own Scrum team, where the fact that you've got this kind of gold line across the team is great, but the person involved in the Scrum team over here is this person, and is missing out on this other set of skills, right? So you really need to be kind of taking steps to foster collaboration and to ensure that where necessary, skills from one person are being brought in. So that was mostly focused on individual contributors, and now shifting a little bit to staffing up for managers, and it's kind of a stupid cartoon, but the Peter principle is probably a well-known kind of concept, the idea that people get promoted to their level of incompetence, right? People who do a good job get promoted, and they get promoted, and they get promoted until they reach the level where they're not really effective, and so obviously you want to avoid that. It's a fairly common thing, I think, across the board. It's something to be careful of. In the area of PM, what we've seen, and I'm probably guilty of this too, is that the skills needed for managers are the same, really, as the skills needed for individual contributors, because as I mentioned before, we don't view managers as just purely HR managers, right? So they are still playing a role in the PM function. They do still need to have those skills, as well as people management, right? Meaning career development, meaning staffing, hiring, firing in some cases, etc. And so one of the things that I've seen, and that is, I think, a fairly common pitfall to be warned about, is kind of tied to the focus I mentioned before about domain expertise, about being a practitioner, which is that the person with the most expertise tends to be the person who gets promoted to a manager role. And that obviously is not necessarily the right answer. It may be. In some cases it may be. In many cases it may not be. And so, what's one thing that's really important is to be able to have a well-defined career path for product managers that does not necessitate moving to a management role. And that is something we've put a lot of effort into. So we've really kind of done a pretty good job, I think, at Workday of defining pretty rigorous standards which say that, we have, I think, 5 levels of individual contributor roles where in order to move from one level to another, you have to have, managed this type of project, you have to have had this type of interaction with X number of customers. So we really try to be pretty rigorous about it and pretty well defined so that we can have those discussions with people and so that we have answers to the question, hey, why wasn't I promoted? And we do really try hard to, again, kind of provide a clear path that doesn't require being promoted to a manager because, we, as you can see from the kind of hierarchy charts that I've shown before, we tie our management roles very tightly to the way that we organize our functionality. And we think that that's important, but what that means is we can't just start making manager positions where we don't need them, right? Manager positions are 100% driven by business need. We can't just promote somebody to a manager just because that person has reached a certain level of maturity or has been in the role for a certain number of years. And so as a result of a lot of that, what we are starting to look at is actually splitting the people management function from the product expertise. And this is something we're just really starting to look at. It's a little bit tricky, but what we're basically saying is that even though the management levels, as I mentioned, are not purely HR managers and will not be, that's not the direction we're going, but what we are starting to say is, you know what, there's a lot of relevant skills here. Domain expertise isn't the only one that's important, and it's not necessarily the fact that the person who's managing the team has to be the biggest expert in that area. It's not necessarily that fact. And so one of the things that we're now starting to do, I mentioned before, we're moving toward actually more specialization rather than less, and this is an example of that. So rather than just having individual contributor product managers in all kind of the same role, we are starting to move toward more specialization, distinguishing between inbound and outbound PM, which I think is actually fairly common in the industry. I don't think we're any kind of great innovator in that regard, but also creating a role that we call functional architect. And the functional architect is really kind of the PM analog to roles that you commonly see in an engineering organization, where somebody might be a technical architect. They're not necessarily a manager, but they have a very deep expertise. They're often working in an advisory role. They're often consulting to other projects. And so we've started to, I don't want to say experiment, it's a little bit more robust than that, but we've really started to, in some cases, have a person who really has deep expertise in the area, but perhaps not some of the other skills like people management, is probably not the best person to actually move to a manager role, but maybe better suited to be a functional architect, where he or she can have influence across a broad set of functionality, can really kind of bring their expertise to bear in a very profound way without necessarily being in the manager role. So the idea then is that the manager, again, is still not just an HR manager, is still playing a role in terms of road mapping, in terms of owning all of the key responsibilities of PM that I mentioned before at that level, but obviously with input from the team, including folks like the functional architect. So this is an area, again, that we're really just now starting to move toward. We see when the distinction between inbound and outbound, the way that we really see it is that, as I mentioned before, most of the individual contributor PMs in my organization spend most of their time supporting a Scrum team. That's where the inbound PMs continue to work. So we'll have inbound PMs supporting Scrum teams. We'll have outbound PMs who are more doing the customer communication, more of the outbound push, doing any kind of training type activities, doing the presentations at customer conferences. And what we see with this kind of split is, again, that in some cases, people like it because some folks are more interested in one area of that than the other. In some cases, they see it as limiting, right? In some cases, this is seen as, limiting. It's narrowing down the kind of menu of activities that they might be doing on any one day. And that's a challenge. In some cases, we're doing this on a rotational basis. So, in some cases where people are interested in both, we're having somebody be an inbound PM for one release and an outbound PM for another. In some cases, we are doing it more permanently. What we do see, though, is that we see a lot of benefit just in terms of A, being able to leverage individual strengths in some cases, and B, being able to manage across a large team. Again, the more specialization we have, in some cases it makes it much easier to manage because we know what people are working on, we know what's important, we're able to manage any kind of dependencies much more easily. And so this model seems to be bearing fruit for us. We're still pretty early in moving towards it, but we're pretty optimistic, and I think that we're going to start to roll this out more and more. Question? Yeah. Great question. So the question was, as you kind of change organization, as you reorg, how do you ensure that processes are continued to be followed and continue to be maybe updated and maintained? It's a great question. It's a especially good question for me because that is not my strength. So process management is not my strength. A few folks in the back who've worked with me before kind of are probably laughing a little bit, but it's not my strength. I have a person who is responsible, so we have a dedicated role. This is not meant to be exhaustive in terms of the organizational model. There are a couple other folks involved, and so we do have a person who reports to me whose title is basically Director of Product Operations, and her role is to define processes, to roll them out, to communicate them, and that's an area that we do focus on a lot. Because absolutely, it's a great question. If you don't pay sufficient attention to that area, things are going to go, it'll be chaos. Great question. I think that is it. That's all I had prepared. So I think at this point, let me just ask if there are any other questions. That's a great question. So the question, if anybody couldn't hear, excuse me, the question was about how do you manage dependencies, because the way that this picture looks, it's like there are these lanes, and how do you kind of work across those lanes? There are huge dependencies, so it's a great question in this area. There's loads and loads of dependencies. As I mentioned, it's really viewed as a single product from a customer's perspective, and so kind of by definition, it's a single set of functionality, so you can be sure there's a lot of dependencies. That is one of the areas for having the kind of product area lead concept. So part of the role of the product area lead is to ensure that dependencies, at least within that product area, are well managed. And we've tried to organize the product areas to make sure that that's where the most dependencies happen. It's not where all the dependencies happen, and so that's part of my job as well, right? So part of my job is to ensure that we're managing dependencies appropriately, and that when we're going to go change something in the pay area that's going to require something in the core area, we're managing that and coordinating it well. So it's hard, and it's definitely an area of big concern. Yeah? That's a great question. So the question was, do I have a single metric? This is potentially a whole nother discussion, but I'll try to make it a little bit short. So I've been talking about the product team for Workday Financials. Now, obviously, we have an engineering organization that's structured similarly. It's larger, but it's structured similarly. We have a quality assurance organization that's structured similarly. We manage the overall kind of line of business using OKRs, objectives and key results, and we are very careful to define those across the entire set of products. So I really don't have a big focus on metrics purely for PM. The metrics that we look at are agreed across the entire set of products, and so it'll include more development-centric functions like bug counts. It will include more product management-centric areas such as results from customer surveys. And it will include certainly quality metrics, which are probably the easiest to measure. We do a lot of customer surveys, and typically that's what we rely on the most for any kind of real metric, but we do be very careful to try to ensure that we have good alignment across development and QA when we do that.
Appreciate some of the technical stuff you brought up, like OKRs, etc. What about using something more subjective, such as asking the team to give a strong or instruction saying, define success for yourself, ignoring the objective?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I have to repeat that. You've got pretty good volume back there. We do a lot of that. That's something that we really leave to the teams. So the culture that we work in at Workday in particular is very collaborative. It's designed to be very collaborative. And so teams are really expected to do that themselves. So, that's not something that I typically review. It's not something that I typically look at, but we do expect that teams themselves will do that as a regular cadence, certainly as part of each release planning. What is it that we did well this release? What is it that we didn't do as well? What do we want to achieve next release? So we strongly encourage that, I would say, but I don't review it myself.
I just want to thank you for the presentation. It was awesome. I just want to dive into the metrics on performance measurement, really. Okay. So what is it that what are the final outcomes of PM's performance that you measure them on? And more specifically, is monetization in there?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what are the metrics that I measure on? And so let's see. That's going to vary, of course, by the level. So at the manager level, where they're really kind of dealing with individual PMs, dealing with individual Scrum teams, they're looking at quality of functional design work. They're looking at quality of outbound communication materials. And so they really are kind of acting almost as teachers in a sense, right? At my level, it's much more about, we are looking at competitive win rates. So we pay a lot of attention to competitive win rates. We pay a lot of attention to, we do look at revenue, but the reality is we're still in high growth mode. And so we're really looking more at customer acquisition. We're looking at customer references. And so we're a little bit at this point, frankly, less laser focused on revenue and more focused on the kind of metrics that we think are important to drive growth. And so again, that's partly references. It's partly more granular than that, references by region, things like that, and just sheer number of essentially customers that we're both winning, losing, and losing to do nothing, because we are still in the early enough stages, you may be surprised to know, but we're still in the early enough stages that a lot of the times when we lose, we're not losing to a competitor, we're losing to a customer deciding not to do anything in terms of moving their financials to the cloud. And so that's something that we focus on very strongly in terms of what can we do to start to reduce that. So I think we're out of time. I hope this was helpful for folks, and I thank you very much for your time.